Sometimes the most daunting part of a big project is figuring out how to get started. And in this video, I want to attempt to answer that for you. How can you get started with this semester-long project? Let's think about the purpose. We're going to try and expand our knowledge of wildlife management through this semester project. So first and foremost, why would we conduct research? What is the point? Well, hopefully you understand that the point of research is to drive management. And not all research is, I'll give you that, but applied research is, and I'm a big fan of applied research. Let's learn something that can help us make a better decision the next time we need to make a decision. And this way we can learn from the past and make better decisions in the future. Here are just a few examples of things we might want to do research on, or how this might drive management. Understanding the needs of a species may help with a reintroduction effort, like we've learned with the black-footed ferret. Understanding a limiting factor may allow managers to decrease or increase the population of concern. We may want to learn more about a cause of mortality so that we can better set an appropriate population level, or a goal for a level for a particular species. And all of this is going to revolve around a very formatted process. And you've learned about it in elementary school, or you should have, the scientific method. It wasn't just a theoretical idea back then. This is what science really follows. And the very first part of that is all centered around asking an effective question. And that question is typically based on some kind of observation that you've made or that someone else has made, or something that you have found interesting and wanting to learn more about. And after you ask this question, you're going to have to do some research on what is already known regarding the question. If everybody just charged right in to try and answer a question, they may not realize that somebody's already answered it, and you could move on and ask a different question. The next step is to develop a hypothesis. What do you expect to find? And this is really important, especially when we get into statistics, to try and prove or fail to disprove, rather, a particular hypothesis. Design an experiment or study. This could be either one, and in our case, oftentimes it's a study. An experiment is a more controlled situation, and we need to design these based upon background research, which is part of your project as well. You're going to have to design a study. You do not have to invent everything from scratch. You can use methods that other people have done in similar studies, and that plays a role then in really taking good notes on what else has been done in your background research. Then you would conduct the study, analyze your results, draw some conclusions, and this is the most important part. Share back with your community on what you found so that other people don't repeat the same study, or that other people then can say, oh, that's great, now that we know this, we can attempt to answer this next piece. So it all comes back to this asking an effective question. How can we ask an effective question? Well, first of all, we have what's called an essential question, or an overarching question. This is your big picture, big umbrella type question. It can't be answered with one simple investigation. It may take several research projects to be able to start answering this essential question. And then we have an investigative question. And an investigative question, it's a researchable question that can be answered with either qualitative or quantitative observations or measurements. So you can go out and describe something, or you can get numbers to back it up. Let's look at this investigative question, and this is kind of the last part of what I'm going to ask you to do in your project, but it's coming up with something that you could suggest as a research proposal for a question that might need to be answered in relation to your overall essential question. So there's three types of investigative questions. The first is descriptive. This is great. This is easy. This is looking at parts of a natural system, focusing on measurable or observable variables that can be represented spatially or as written descriptions, estimations, averages, medians, or ranges. So this might be things like, when does mating occur in elk? How many bears are in Rocky Mountain National Park? Where does the mountain lion go throughout a year? How frequently Do turtles mate? Those are all descriptive questions that you could go out and answer fairly simply. The next is a comparative question. With the comparative, you're focusing on still one measured variable, but you're comparing it into at least two different things. So two different locations, times, organisms, populations, that you want to know if there's a difference. Maybe what is the difference between north and south facing slopes concerning tree density? Or which part of Rocky Mountain National Park do more bears reside in? Anything like that, where you're just comparing a few places, you're comparing a few different time periods, you're comparing two different organisms, whatever. Correlative then is a little bit harder to get out. This one's looking at a relationship. It's looking for a pattern. It's asking if one thing affects another. And so for this one, you might focus on two variables and you're seeing if there's a relationship between them. So does A cause B, or does A go up when B goes down? Is blank dependent upon something else? A lot of times we're doing this with time or temperature or some kind of a continual variable. Is elevation would be another good example. Okay, so a couple of quick tips on writing good questions. First of all, try to avoid your open-ended questions. Why is a tough question to answer. Drill it down to a few potential options and then ask a more specific question. So if you asked, why do bears have large home ranges? That's a pretty big question. So maybe you would drill it down to, how much food does a bear require? How is food distributed on the landscape? How many locations does a bear need to travel in a day to obtain enough calories? Something like that. That's not a great question. I'm making it up as I go here, but the big, broad why questions are really tough to answer. You need to drill it down to some more answerable, measurable questions. Stick to categories, those descriptive, correlative, and comparative questions, and that will help make sure that you don't have this broad, open-ended question. Okay, how does this apply to our project? Well, the first thing I want you to do is to develop your essential question. But how do you do that? Well, you know what? That's the easiest part. Think about what interests you. Here are a whole list of topics, and these are on your assignment sheets too. But what are some topics that you have found interesting or you've learned about maybe even before this class and you want to learn more about it? There's a lot of options. That's the fun part. Find something that you're passionate about or that you really want to learn more about. And I'm going to pull out from this list down there at the bottom in yellow how certain land management practices might impact populations of a wildlife species. All right, so that's a pretty broad, essential, topic. It's a broad topic. It's not a question yet. How could we develop that into a question? How can certain land management practices, or let me rephrase that, how certain land management practices might impact populations of a species? Okay, well, what are we talking about? Land management practices like, what about forest management? Cutting trees down. Do cutting trees down impact a particular species of wildlife? Maybe a species like the Aberd's squirrel, that little black-eared tufted squirrel that runs around our ponderosa pine forest. Okay, now maybe we're getting somewhere. So we can make this more specific. Like, how does restoring a ponderosa pine forest to healthy conditions impact the population of Aberd's squirrels? All right, so we take that question. Here's our little Aberd's squirrel over here on our right. And now we go, okay, that's still a big question. That's our essential question. We want to drive this down into some sub-questions that we can go and do some background research on, all of which are going to relate back to this essential question. Again, remember our essential question is like a big umbrella with our smaller sub-questions underneath. They all have to relate to each other. Well, what do we think might impact Aberd's squirrel, or what do we need to know in order to answer this question? We probably need to know the habitat requirements of an Aberd's squirrel to know how cutting trees down might impact them. We might need to know what they eat. So what are the food requirements? Maybe we need to know, how are ponderosa pine forests being restored? What does that look like? How is that changing our forest? What impact does thinning a forest have on an Abert squirrel? Maybe someone else has already looked at how cutting trees down in an Abert squirrel dominated area affects their population. So let's take a look at those 4 sub-questions. After we have answered those questions, then we'll have a pretty good idea of what we might find if we asked an investigative question about Abert squirrel in an area that's been thinned, that we could go out and see if what the research says is also holding true in our area. So the next step in this process, and by the way, what you've done so far, you've asked that essential question, you've come up with sub-questions, then you need to go out and research those sub-questions. That's your literature search. That's going out and putting all those pieces together, and those answers should then drive this investigative question. We need to think about specifics. What could we ask that we could potentially answer if we had the appropriate resources and time to do it? Well, make it one of our 3 types of questions. Think about a specific location or population to ask the question about. This would include where you would end up conducting your research if you were to go out and do it. In our case, maybe we want to look at McGregor Ranch right up by Estes. Maybe you've heard about some of the thinning and forest restoration that has gone up there. So how will thinning the ponderosa pine on McGregor Ranch impact the Abert squirrel population on the ranch? That is a nice correlative question. Does thinning impact population? Or we could look at, is there a difference in the population levels of Abert squirrels in a treated area or an untreated area at McGregor Ranch? We would approach these research questions with different methods because you're asking a slightly different question. So now you've developed all of your questions. You've developed your essential question, you've developed your sub-questions, you've developed an investigative question that you may or may not end up using because you may need to change it once you've done some of your research. So what are your next steps? First of all, start researching all your sub-questions. Start finding the answers. And a really helpful way to do this is by using a reference organizer, and I'll provide you with another video that you can watch on how to do this to keep all of your research in one place, and it becomes a relatively easy process. Secondly, pay attention to the methods that you're going to read about while you're reading about other studies, because you have to put your own methods into your research proposal. Write your literature review. This is the findings of your sub-question. So first here you do the research, and then you have to actually write it up. And then you have to write a research proposal. Don't forget this piece. This is putting all those pieces together and kind of the real-life application piece. The proposal is where you use your investigative question. Write a proposal that addresses one of the following questions, or it addresses these things, sorry. What you're trying to answer, where you would do it, what's your hypothesis. Base that upon your background research. What are your methods or your protocols do you propose in order to answer your question? Did any of the studies you read have methods that might work for your study that you could use? And if not, have we done anything in class that you might use? And if not, can you just get creative and come up with a method that might work to answer your question? What do you expect the results of your research to show? You need to think about it. Based on your background research, you probably have a pretty good idea of what you think you'd find. And that's it. This doesn't need to be a mind-numbingly difficult process. Break this down into step-by-step, but I'll tell you it's important that you get started right away because this is not something you want to try and do at the last minute. As always, make sure you ask questions if you get stuck, and you can change directions if you start down one path and it just doesn't seem to be leading anywhere. But get started by coming up with your questions. That's the most important piece. Good luck.